Hello, welcome to Alyssa Jean's Reviews. I am your captain for this series of videos, Captain Alyssa, and I am so excited to bring you the first installment of my Star Trek Top 100, where I will be counting down my list of my favorite or my best 100 Star Trek episodes out of the first 5 original legacy shows. So I did a separate video where I did all the rules and stuff like that. So if you're interested in that, the description below will have the link to that, as well as I'll put the link to that at the end of this video. So let me jump into it. This video is going to be number 100 through 76. And the format will be that I'm going to go through most of them fairly quickly. However, I have pre-selected 5 of these episodes that I would like to spend a little bit more time talking about. It's not having anything to do with their numbers. Like I didn't decide, well, whatever number 88 is or 87 is, I'm going to talk about it more. No, it's 5 episodes that I wanted to spend more time on for various reasons. So I'm actually going to start with number 100 as one of those 5 episodes. So let's go ahead and talk about what my number 100 is, and then we will go quickly through some of the other ones.
Number 100.
Okay, so let's start with my number 100. So this is an episode that you can also find on my top 10 most underrated episode list. It is from the original series, and it is number 100. Is There in Truth No Beauty? So I rewatched all of these episodes that I'm going to spend extra time on before I did this video. And upon my rewatch of this episode, I can see why I like it more than others. I can see why it's pretty lowly rated on IMDb. There's a lot of hokiness involved, a lot of hokey acting, and not really a great plot. Like the person who seems like he's the antagonist dies toward the beginning, and like I don't know, it's kind of a weird like climax. I don't know. It's, the stakes don't seem very high, so it's a weirdly structured episode. So I can kind of see why I would be pretty rare in putting it in a top 100, but I can tell you exactly why it is in my top 100. And 2 reasons. The first one is I love the way that they were being creative with an alien species. This will ring true of another original series episode that I will get to later in my top 100. I believe it's going to be in the next video, I think. But I always love it when Star Trek is able to get a little creative, think a little bit outside the box, not just have aliens look exactly like humans in the case of the original series, and then in the other shows they would just have aliens with little bumps on their heads or nose ridges or whatever, and like not very creative. Like there's a vast galaxy out there. There's going to be different kind of life forms out there. So that's why I find the Medusans to be a really interesting concept. Now, watching it now and looking at this show that was made in the 60s, it's just a bunch of like flashy lights. It's like all these flashy lights on the screen they give you a seizure. Oh no, my Christmas tree is out of control! Ah! Like, and we're supposed to like suspend disbelief and like say that this is this creature that is so ugly that it makes people go crazy, even though it's a bunch of flashy lights going. But you know what? It was made in the 60s. We kind of have to suspend disbelief, and I still appreciate the concept, even though if it looks a little bit hokey now. But they adapted this concept in modern Trek. So we have the character of Zero in Star Trek Prodigy, who is a Medusan, and Zero has like this robot body that they've put the flashy lights into and can talk and walk around. And that's a really interesting concept, and it started here. That really innovative concepts started back in the 60s with this episode. The other reason that I absolutely love this episode and it has to make my top 100 is that it is pretty much the only original series episode with an independent, strong female character. I've talked about this in previous videos, but most female characters in the original series serve one of three functions. One is to bring Captain Kirk his coffee or his food or his TPS reports. Two is to be a shallow, underdeveloped love interest of one of the male characters, and not just Kirk. Chekhov had a few, Scotty had a couple, McCoy, Spock, all of them had a love interest, and so sometimes female characters are just there for that purpose. And the third reason you might see female characters is to be the villain. Now you might ask, what about Uhura? Uhura's a little different, but she was also very underdeveloped. I think most people will agree that she didn't really get character development until the movies. I think on the show, she's, let's be honest, a glorified receptionist. She even has the earpiece. So women are not generally portrayed as independent or individual human beings since the Cage, because when the Cage came out, they were like, no, we don't want that, so we have to portray women this way. But then here's Dr. Miranda Jones, played by Dr. Pulaski herself, Diana Muldaur, who is different. She is completely turning down the advances of Kirk and McCoy, and Kirk and McCoy are creepy as fuck when they're eating dinner, like all hitting on, oh, she's just a pretty lady. And like, really, is that just how people interacted with women in the 60s? Or men interacted with women in the 60s? Is that really what it was? Anyways, so they're like all hitting on her and she doesn't care. And there's that one dude who's like, oh, I'm in love with you. And she's like, whatever. Like, I'm my own fucking person. And I kind of think it's implied that she sort of has this connection to the Medusan. She kind of like, I don't know if she's in love with the Medusan, but she's kind of more interested in the Medusan than she is in any of the human characters. And I see that as kind of a queer analogy, whether it was meant that way or not. My viewing of it is as it is, because she is more interested in a love interest that is outside of the norm. It's not all the cis hetero men who are hitting on her or professing their undying love for her. It's these flashy Christmas lights that go which is pretty badass, I think. And I don't think like they implicitly state like she's in love with the Medusan or whatever, but it kind of seems that way. So I think that's really cool. And so for those reasons, this episode has to be in my top 100 despite its flaws. So it is my number 100. And now let's go ahead and get into a few more episodes, and I will see you back here again for my number 91. All right, so let's get into my number 99, The Ensigns of Command from Star Trek The Next Generation, an episode that did not make my top 10 underrated list, but should have, as I do think this is a vastly underrated episode. I think it is a far superior Data episode to the more popular fourth season Data's Day. This is a sneaky good character episode for Data, as he is put in a situation that is outside of his wheelhouse, and it's very interesting. Also, this episode introduces the Shellyak, a villain I wish we saw a little bit more often. Now moving on to number 98, the Cloudminders from the original series. This episode has some really powerful social critique that is more relevant today than it was at the time. It's definitely getting into not only class issues, but class issues as related to the environment and how lower class people are more subject to be harmed by the pollution and the harm to the environment that corporations do. So I really love watching this episode today because it is so relevant for what is happening right now. Now moving on to number 97, we have Ceasefire from Star Trek Enterprise. So this is the second season Andorian episode, and this one generally is not as well thought of as the first season episode, the Andorian Incident. But I think this one's actually a lot better than the Andorian Incident because we get more character development of the great Jeffrey Combs' Shran character, and we get into more of the complexities of the relationship between the Andorians and the Vulcans, which was only touched on in the Andorian Incident episode, which is not in my top 100. This one, to me, is better. Moving on to number 96, staying within Star Trek Enterprise, KIR'SHARA from the fourth season. This is the climactic conclusion of that 3-part Vulcan history series of episodes in that fourth season. This is chosen to represent that entire trilogy. I do not have either of the other 2 episodes on this top 100. I do think that trilogy is a bit overrated because I think the villain is over the top ridiculous and there's no way anybody should believe that he's a logical Vulcan. However, it comes to a very interesting conclusion, drawing that bridge between how the Vulcans are assholes in the first couple seasons of Enterprise to what they would become in Spock's time. So it's got to give some recognition to that trilogy. Moving on to number 95, The Wounded from Star Trek The Next Generation's fourth season. This episode, in a lot of ways, is the birth of Deep Space Nine, as it is the first episode where Chief O'Brien gets the spotlight, and it is also the first episode that features the Cardassians, although they are portrayed a little differently here than they would eventually be portrayed in Deep Space Nine. Also the debut of Mark Alamo as a Cardassian, even if he is not Gul Dukat yet at this point. And the last thing I have to say about this is no! You, Cardassian. It's what I became because of you. Moving on to number 94, our man Bashir from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This is an episode that by all rights I should hate because I typically do not like these silly comedy episodes that take place in the holodeck, especially in Deep Space Nine. However, what sells this episode to me is the great chemistry between Andrew Robinson and Alexander Sigdig, and also the fact that Avery Brooks gets to play a James Bond villain, a role that he was born to play. At number 93, we have the Observer Effect from Star Trek Enterprise's fourth season. So this is an interesting episode because it turns the Prime Directive on its head. We are seeing the Prime Directive from the point of view of advanced aliens who are trying to decide whether to interfere with human culture or not. And the fact that it turns out that these advanced aliens are the Organians from the original series makes it all that much more interesting. Moving on to number 92, we have Distant Origin from Star Trek Voyager's third season. So this is the famous dinosaur episode, but more than that, I think it is a really interesting look at the debate between science and doctrine, and also a really strong Chakotay episode, something that would be in great shortage in later seasons of Voyager. I should point out that this episode represents a change in the ranking order of my Voyager episodes from my top 20 Voyager video that I did, but I will get into that a little bit more later on. But for right now, let's stop and talk about number 91.
Number 91.
Okay, so my number 91 is a two-parter, a pair of episodes that might surprise some people, and because I haven't really talked about them a whole lot on my channel. Now, if you're reading my name below and you're thinking that I'm talking about Redemption, think again. I am actually talking about Unification Parts 1 and 2 from The Next Generation Season 5. So if I had done this video a couple of years ago, I probably would not have put this in my top 100, but this episode gets what I am going to be hereby referring to as the modern track bump. And I will be talking about that a couple more times at least in this video and probably in future videos to come as well. So I always liked Spock in this episode. I have always thought that this is a much better original series guest star appearance than the season 6's Relics with Scotty, where Scotty's just running around acting like an idiot and like just out of touch with everything. And it's just kind of dumb and he's out of character. Whereas this plays off of Spock's need for peace. He's basically the true space hippie. Like, forget those assholes in that fucking episode. What was that episode called? Not This Side of Paradise. What was that episode called? What's that episode called? The Way to Eden. Yeah, that one. Forget about those jokers. Spock is the true space hippie because he really wants to create peace. And it started in Star Trek 6. He was the driving force behind making peace with the Klingons, and he references that in this episode where he says, the reason why I'm doing this by myself because I was going to get Captain Kirk killed, and I'm not going to do that again. I'm just going to put no one at risk but myself. But he's a very selfless person who's going for peace, and I really love that. And the reason why this gets the modern track bump is because in Star Trek Discovery season 3, where an episode they try to cutely call Unification Part 3, they show that in the 32nd century, Spock's efforts have bear some fruit, and that now the Romulans and Vulcans live together, and what used to be called Vulcan, now called Navarre, and that makes a lot of sense given that Romulus gets destroyed, that they are able to reunify, and it's all because of Spock. And when the moment when in that episode where Michael Burnham sees a little video of she sees Leonard Nimoy's Spock and like sees that Spock was responsible for it. A little tear in my eye. That's so nice. I love that Spock's efforts became this amazing, beautiful thing where the Romulans and Vulcans ultimately do come together. So that's why it gets a little bit of a modern track bump, because it makes Spock's character development even better. And also, there's some great moments. There's, good fan service and bad fan service. I think this episode, especially part 2, has a lot of good fan service where Spock says something like, "In your own way, you are as stubborn as another captain of the Enterprise I once knew." And I love that. And the little back and forth that he has with Data when this has always been one of my favorite lines, where he tells Data that he has by design what every Vulcan has always wanted, and Data says, "Well, you have given up what I've always strived for in my life." And that was such an interesting conversation, because Data was always thought of as by the fans as like the new version of Spock, like the emotionless character. So for them to have that little exchange, that's really good. And then, of course, huge character development between Spock and his father. Even though Sarek dies off screen in this episode, we get to have this storyline that has been ongoing since the original series. That Spock and Sarek have this kind of love-hate relationship. They argue a lot, and it's just been an ongoing thing. And to see that carried out in this episode through Picard was quite beautiful as well. So that's another reason that I really love these episodes, and they do make my top 100. Now, just for some reasons, as far as why I say this wouldn't have made my top 100 necessarily a couple years ago, I have to consider anything that has the two-parter that has the same title, I Have Made the Rule. I consider that as one whole. And let's be frank, part one is just a nothing episode. It's just all set up. If these had separate titles and they weren't both called the same thing, and I was counting them separately, I would have that part two ranked higher than number 91, and part one would have nothing to do with my top 100. But since I'm considering them together, I kind of consider it, as a 1 2 hour movie like episode. That does hold it back because part one is nothing. And also, as my screen name references, Sela is just ridiculous. Like, she was bad enough in Redemption, but she's just kind of over the top. And it's just the whole plot of trying to send an invasion force in the Vulcan ships is kind of dumb. I'm just going to be frank with you. So this episode, or these episodes, make my top 100 on the strength of the Spock storyline and the connections he makes with the characters and the connections he makes with his father, and the fact that his efforts bear so much fruit in the future. That's why these episodes make my top 100, certainly not because of the villain. All right, let's move on, and I will see you again very shortly, so hang tight. Okay, continuing forward with number 90, The Quickening from Star Trek Deep Space Nine's 4th season. This is the absolute best Dr. Bashir character episode in the entire series, as Bashir is put in an unfamiliar situation where he cannot be God. He cannot save everyone, and he has a hard time reconciling with that, and I find this to be super interesting, and that's why this makes my top 100. Now moving on to number 89, The Mind's Eye from the 4th season of The Next Generation. This is actually the episode that got me back into The Next Generation when these episodes were originally airing, because I gave up halfway through season 2 because it sucked, but I happened upon this episode in rerun and I got right back into it, and I still consider it one of my favorites, and I just have to get this out of my system as this is a very quotable episode for me. But I remember everything. Good, Mr. LaForge, very good. And you speak the lies of a Tarkak. Sorry, I just had to get that all out of my system. Now we move on to number 88, which is Deja Q from the 3rd season of The Next Generation. This is the first episode where we finally get that lighthearted Q. He's not so serious and menacing all the time. It was one of the few really great comedy episodes in Star Trek, and especially the interactions between Q and Data are gold throughout this episode.
Number 87.
All right, let's talk about my number 87. And my number 87 is Donut, 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 beep, 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 beep. AMOK time from the original series. So at first glance, number 87 might seem a little far back for a lot of people, because I do feel like many people may have this in their top 25 all-time Star Trek episodes, possibly even in their top 10. But for me, what if I told you that 2 years ago, this would not have even made my top 100 at all? And the fact that it is even as high as number 87 is due once again to the modern track bump. And I'll talk about why it gets the modern track bump in a couple minutes. But first, let me talk about why I've always thought this episode to be a little bit overrated. Like, I've never thought it was terrible. I just have never thought it was like one of those top tier episodes that other people seem to think that it is. And mainly it has to do with, I kind of had a hard time buying that this was the Vulcan culture, that they had this very tribal culture when they ring the bells and bang on gongs and things like that. And not that it's not possible for this very scientific-based, logical-based society to all have this more tribal side to them, but the fact that the dots aren't really connected, that they just kind of throw this at us and expect us to believe it, and having the fight to the death. What is logical about a fight to the death? Nothing. So I've always just kind of had a hard time. It just felt like that fight to the death is a contrived it's a plot contrivance in order to get this dramatic scene where Spock thinks he kills Kirk. So I think that's why I've always thought this episode not as great as other people do. Although I've always liked it because of the character interactions. I think it's a very nice sentiment that Spock considers McCoy as one of his two best friends. I think this is the first time that we get that because all they do is bicker at each other usually. So I love the connection between the characters, and I think that's why I would have always liked this episode. But as I said, there are reasons why I maybe don't love it as much as other people. Also, this episode came on before Journey to Babel, where Sarek is introduced. Why was Sarek not introduced in this episode? It's weird this Fox family is not there at all. Like, I feel like his wedding, that's a big deal. Like, I feel like they would be there. But anyway, the reason why this gets the Modern Trek bump is Strange New Worlds and their inclusion of T'Pring as part of Spock's story. Now, that might seem odd that this would give this the Modern Trek bump because Strange New Worlds retcons the fuck out of this episode. Like, there's no way that this version of T'Pring was ever dating this version of Spock. And in this episode, we see Uhura seeing T'Pring and going, "Oh, who is she? She's beautiful." But in Strange New Worlds, she very much has very many interactions with T'Pring and knows goddamn well who she is. So they retconned it. But sometimes I think it is good for Modern Trek to retcon a show made in the 60s because that just makes it so much more sense. And so I kind of like to think of this episode in context of, well, let's pretend that they did know each other for a while and they were dating for a little while, and that makes everything that changes the context and like changes T'Pring's ultimate rejection of him, and I love that. So I think that is why this episode gets a little bit of a Modern Trek bump, and for me goes from outside of the top 100 all the way up to number 87, even though I know for some people maybe 87 is still a bit far back. Maybe you would have this a lot higher than I do, but hey, it's in my top 100. That's the top 100 is the cream of the crop, so it's doing pretty good. All right, so let's move on to a few more episodes, and I'll see you back here again very shortly. Okay, moving on to number 86, Past Tense, Parts 1 and 2 from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I really appreciate the social commentary of these episodes, and I am a little bit scared about how accurate they were about 2024. I mean, it's not exact, but it's kind of close. Let's hope that we have as optimistic as a future as this episode portrays. The time travel logic is awful, but, you know, I look past that because I love the social commentary. Moving on to number 85, a preemptive strike from Star Trek The Next Generation's 7th season. This is an episode that gets the Modern Trek bump because we, spoiler alert for Picard Season 3, get Ro coming back and kind of tying up loose ends from this episode, which was kind of a heartbreaking episode for Picard, but it's one of those episodes where you can kind of see both sides of the issue, which is something I'm going to talk about in more in depth about a different episode coming up very soon. Now let's move on to number 84, Babel 1 from Star Trek Enterprise's 4th season. This is part 1 of that Andorian trilogy of season 4. And I know I'm alone on this, but I actually kind of like the Andorian trilogy better than the Vulcan trilogy of that same season. I just love, well, first of all, Jeffrey Combs, but secondly, how these episodes really establish the origins of the Federation. And that takes me to number 83, which is United. That is part 2 of the Andorian trilogy in the 4th season of Star Trek Enterprise, the continuation of Babel 1. And this is like the true origins of the Federation. This is prequels at its best. This is what Enterprise should have always been. Now moving on to number 82, The Siege from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and I'm using this one episode to represent that Bajoran trilogy that starts off season 2 of Deep Space Nine, includes the episodes The Homecoming and The Circle, but this is the climactic conclusion to that. It's not quite as good as the season 6 station takeover story arc that would happen, but this is still pretty exciting, and especially after season 1 of Deep Space Nine, which was, left a lot to be desired. This is actually a pretty damn good episode. Now we move on to number 81, getting back to Star Trek Enterprise Stratagem, which is from the 3rd season Xindi arc, and believe me, this will be the first of many episodes in that season 3 Enterprise Xindi arc. This is chronologically when the story starts getting really interesting, because we're diving into some complex character stuff with the character of DEJA, who would become a very key character moving forward in this story.
Number 80.
Okay, let's have a little conversation about my number 80. So this time we are getting into the world of Star Trek Voyager, and my number 80 is Prey from Star Trek Voyager's excellent 4th season. So back at number 92, I mentioned with Distant Origins that having that in that position represented a change in the ranking order for my Voyager episodes. And that is because when I did my top 20 Voyager episode video a year ago or so, I had this episode Prey as my number 15 out of the top 20, and I had Distant Origins as number 14, so it was ranked higher. But upon retrospect, I think that this episode is actually a lot better than that one. And in fact, I almost think maybe I didn't move it up high enough at number 80. It could even go even higher than number 80. And yes, once again, this does get a bit of a modern track bump. And not quite in the same way that the previous 2 episodes I talk about get a modern track bump. It's more in an indirect way. It's because more of that 7 of 9 is in the spotlight lately from Picard season 3, and I really, really enjoy seeing how far she's come as a character. I think within the history of Star Trek, she probably has had the most character development out of any character from point A to point B, like looking back from when she first came over from the Borg ship to where she is as a captain of a starship, the captain of the Enterprise G. By the end, sorry if I just spoiled things for you, but you should be watching Picard season 3, so it's not my fault. So she ends up as a captain at the end of that season, and that's a long, long, long ways. And there are a few episodes within Voyager that are really great character episodes for 7 of 9 and that really show her struggling to learn how to be human, how to interact with a crew, how to be a part of a crew, and not part of a collective. And there are a couple episodes that are really good with that. There's another one coming up in my next video, that 75 to 51 video. There will be another one like this. But this one here is a really important 7 of 9 episode because she's trying to learn how to follow orders and do what she's supposed to do, even though she strongly disagrees with the captain, and she kind of fails on this one. But what makes it really interesting is that there's no clear-cut right or wrong answer here. Janeway is trying to be the compassionate one, which she always is, and that's kind of her philosophy, unless we get into season 6, which we're not going to get into that. But in any case, that's kind of her philosophy, showing compassion. But 7 of 9 is kind of right that she did save the ship by not showing compassion. So she shouldn't have, disobeyed orders, but she also had some good points. And the complexities of this make it really, really interesting. And the fact that even at the end, 7 of 9 is like, you want me to be an individual, and yet you shun my individuality when I assert it because it's not the way that you personally think. And although I don't think she's 100% right on that, I think that's a very interesting conversation that they have there. I don't think she's totally wrong either. So I just love that. Also, in this episode, we have kind of two villains. We have the Hirogen and Species 8472. And it turns out in this case, Species 8472, not that much of a villain, just trying to get home. So that is really interesting. And this is easily the best and probably the only good, quite honestly, Hirogen episode. Later on, they devolve into running Nazi scenarios in the holodeck. What is Star Trek's obsession with recreating Nazi Germany? I get so tired of it. Like, why? So the Hirogens, generally not great villains, but here they bring in the great Tony Todd, who's going to appear as two other characters throughout my top 100, and you should know who those other two characters are. But here he appears as the only good Hirogen character in the only good Hirogen episode, in my opinion. Also, it's so good to go back and watch good character development for 7 of 9, because although she ends in a really interesting place in Star Trek Picard, there's some bumps in the road in season 6 and 7 when they really try to turn into this melodramatic soap opera. I wish season 7 did not go in the direction that it did. So it's really nice to go back and watch a good 7 of 9 character development episode. So Prey comes in at number 80, and I almost could be a little higher. This is a goddamn good episode. All right, let's move on to do 79, 78, and 77, and then I will be back to talk to you about my number 76 to close out this video. Okay, at number 79, the Doomsday Machine from the original series. Another one that I might have a little further back than other people might, and I think mainly because Commodore Decker kind of drives me crazy, and the fact that Spock just capitulates to him also drives me crazy. However, it is still in my top 100 because it's one of those great space-based adventure episodes that I love in the original series, as opposed to Kirk, Spock, and McCoy beaming down to a planet all the time. Now moving on to number 78, we're in that same genre of the original series, that great space-based adventure episode, the Tholian Web. And this one I really love because Kirk is only in it for like 10 minutes, and it gives the rest of the crew a chance to shine, including Uhura, who has a really strong episode here. So also introduces the Tholians, who I wish we would see more of. Moving on now to number 77, The Wire from Star Trek Deep Space Nine's second season. This is an episode that grew on me after a while, because at first I didn't like it because we never really get Garak's true origin story, but in retrospect that's kind of what makes this great. This is a truly great Garak episode, the first such episode, and this is the one that puts Garak on the map, and Garak is one of the best characters in all of Star Trek, so I gotta give kudos to this episode for that.
And now, number 76.
All right, let's close off this video by talking about my number 76. And my number 76 is once again from the original series. It is The Cage, the pilot episode of the original series. So the first thing that I need to address is why The Cage counts, because it didn't air with the original series. In fact, nobody saw it, or at least not anyone in the public saw it until the 80s. So why does it count? And the reason why I think it counts is because, well, the idea that it wouldn't count is antiquated. Now it is on any streaming service that has ever had Star Trek. When Netflix had it, it was there. Paramount Plus has it, it's there. It's right in there as one of the episodes that you can watch. It's episode number 1 in order of the original series. If you get a DVD or Blu-ray, or even if you have the old VHS tapes, it's there. And most importantly, it is a part of canon. Discovery and Strange New Worlds have very much established that this episode is canon, and therefore it counts. So first I gotta though talk about the elephant in the room before I get into why I like this episode and why it is as high as my number 76 is there's a couple of really cringy sexist moments. One of them being when Pike sees the yeoman on the bridge and treats her like crap and goes like, I just still can't get used to the idea of a woman being on the bridge. And then he goes, not you, number one, you're different. And that's a really cringy, hard to watch thing. But I try to think of it in the context of this was in the 60s. They are putting out this pilot. They are trying to convince network executives to take a show that has strong female leads and has female characters on the bridge of a starship. Which ultimately didn't work because they rejected the show largely for that reason. So that was like throwing a bone to the network executives. Yeah, I mean, we do have this strong female lead, but look, he doesn't like it. Like Captain Pike is still sexist bastard. So, it's okay, network executives, but they didn't buy it. So, but when I look at it, that's kind of how the lens I look at it through. I have a harder time whisking away the weird Pike desire to own slaves, Orion female slaves. I don't know. When they actually show him in the flashback thingy, the imaginary thingy, he's not okay with it, but he does kind of mention it earlier in the episode when he's talking to the doctor. And like, okay, that's weird. I don't know how much being in the 60s forgives that. But I think ultimately he's not okay with it. So, all right, I guess I'll go with that. There's a couple weird things like that, and I think that in a lot of ways this episode is very dated. Watching it now, first of all, no canon has been established, so they're referring to phasers as lasers. They're referring to themselves as an Earth ship, which they will often do in the beginning of the original series with Kirk's Enterprise as well, because they haven't figured out the Federation or any of that stuff. And I always get a kick out of how long it takes them to use the transporter. Like they go ramp it up for a really long time, and then it goes for like a really long time. It takes like 10 minutes for them to be down the planet. I always find that to be really funny. So there's a lot of data stuff. Also, when the crew meets those old people who turn out to be imaginary, the one guy is like, "Oh, and in the last 18 years, we've figured out how to break the time warp barrier. Now we can go so much faster now." Whereas in current canon, there would have been no difference in how fast they could go between 18 years before and that time period. It would have been the same. So, what I would love is for Strange New Worlds to recreate this episode with modern track canon and using Anson Mount. I would love if they did that. Like I know the Strange New Worlds, the timeline is beyond this, but they could like do a flashback episode. They could do an episode where they look at this. I don't know. Maybe other people will think that the cage has already been done to death, but I would love that because I would love to see like how Ensign Mount's Pike reacts in these situations and see them eliminate kind of the sexist stuff and the weird like the laser stuff and things like that. It'd be pretty cool. But anyways, so as far as like why I do love this episode, as far as it is dated in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways, it's kind of timeless. It's kind of a really well written story, an intriguing and interesting story. It's kind of one of the better written stories in the original series, if I'm going to be honest. I don't think that they did too many episodes after this that were as well written as this one. Just really getting into this character that we just met, getting into his psyche, getting into his fears, his hopes, his dreams, and him kind of reconciling that and yeah, struggling with whether he should leave Starfleet. It's not called Starfleet yet, but you know what I'm saying. And the use of these aliens, the Telosians, who have these abilities to make people think whatever they want to think or see whatever they want to see, and putting humans in a cage and things like that. That's all well written, really intriguing stuff. By the way, when he's first in this zoo thing, I noticed upon my rewatch that it's kind of really funny how there's like this gorilla creature doing like an interpretive dance, and like then you see another cage of this bird creature who's really doing an interpretive dance. It's just funny. I don't know. But yeah, as antiquated as this episode is in a lot of ways, it kind of still stands the test of time. And that is why The Cage, despite its 1960s sexism, is a number 76 to close out the first portion of my top 100. Alrighty, hope you enjoyed my first segment of my top 100. Please join me next month where I will continue forward and do 75 through 51, and I will pick 5 additional episodes to talk about. And don't worry, I did notice that in this video I picked 3 original series episodes and no episodes from Star Trek Enterprise or Star Trek Deep Space Nine to spend extra time talking about. So fear not, that will be remedied in the next video. So I will see you then. Please subscribe if you have not already, and I'll see you next time.